Visitations from deceased family members have been a staple of ghost stories for hundreds of years. Even today, stories of this ilk seem to appear on online paranormal message boards with far more regularity than any other creepy tales. The nature and specifics of these posts tend to vary widely. In some of the more disturbing encounters, the author recalls an abusive late family member returning to this world to wreak havoc on their relations one last time. Others are a little more wholesome and tell of benevolent ancestors using their supernatural prowess to help the loved ones they left behind. It is these latter stories that we will be focusing on in today's video. So, if you're looking for a bit of a sentimental scare, I guess you've come to the right place. Here are 3 creepy but wholesome encounters with deceased family members. Number 3. A visit from my ex. My ex-boyfriend and I met when we were in our final year of high school at a mutual friend's house party. We grew up in the same town, but never had encountered each other prior to this because he went to a different school. Unlike me and my friends, he was not a private school kid. I think that was part of the reason I liked him. I was fascinated by his stories of breaking the rules. But he was so much more than some kin from the wrong side of the tracks. He was the funniest person I've ever met. He also knew everything about golf, so much so that he could hold his own in golf talk with my father. This infuriated my dad because he thought my boyfriend was too rough to know about such a classy sport. As we got older, my boyfriend and I grew apart. I went off to college, and he stayed in our hometown. We tried long distance, but he didn't handle it well. He was always into smoking weed, but around this time he started experimenting with other drugs. By the time I was home for Christmas, he was using hard drugs every day. The drugs turned him into a completely different person, making him selfish and unfaithful. I broke up with him after a friend texted me a picture of him making out with some girl in a nightclub. I later discovered that he had cheated on me multiple times. I didn't return to my hometown much after that, but friends would text me updates about him. Several times, he was admitted to the hospital after overdosing. Somebody told me he'd lost his job. Another said he was living on the streets. I couldn't stand the thought of him being reduced to such a pitiful state and did everything I could to keep him out of my mind. This included drug use of my own. One early morning, I stumbled into my dorm room after more than 12 hours of partying. I had taken drugs in an attempt to stay awake and keep drinking, but now it was time for sleep. I passed out on my bed, but was quickly awoken by a hand shaking my shoulder. It was my ex-boyfriend. He looked pretty good. Actually, he looked really good. He looked like I imagined he would look if he never got into drugs. "You don't need to worry about me," he told me. "I'm okay now. It's all good. No more drugs. I'm so sorry I put you through all that. But I'm good now. I've stopped. You need to stop too, before you're made to stop like I was." With that, my phone rang, waking me up. That conversation had been a dream, but it seemed so realistic. I know what you're expecting that phone call to be about, but it was actually a pretty inconsequential call from my friend wondering if she had left her wallet in my purse. But that other call did come later in the day. My mom was the one who broke the news to me. My ex-boyfriend passed away the night before from an accidental overdose. He had come to me in that dream to apologize and make peace, but I think mainly to warn me against going down the same road as him. And I'm thankful he did. That was 3 years ago, and I haven't touched any drugs since, not even alcohol. Every time I'm in my hometown, I lay a golf ball on his grave and thank him for saving my life, and for the opportunity to spend some of it with him. Number 2. My granddad, the chef. My grandfather developed a love of cooking while serving in the British Army. Officially, he was a navigator, but during his downtime he would sneak into the mess kitchen and help prepare meals for his fellow soldiers. This started as an excuse to hang out with a female cook he had a crush on, but after a while he found himself really embracing the duties of a cook. After a while, he even received formal permission to help out in the kitchen whenever his schedule permitted. After leaving the Army, my grandfather retrained as a chef and eventually opened his own restaurant. He retired before I was born, but I have great memories of him cooking for me as a kid. He made a lot of fancy gourmet dishes, but my absolute favorite meal of his was a classic toasted ham and cheese sandwich. I'm sure it bothered him that I overlooked all of his Michelin star meals in favor of such a simple snack. But he never voiced any disapproval and would make me one whenever I asked. I was 16 when my grandfather died. He left us some cool stuff, but the most meaningful thing to me was a piece of paper dated to the same day he received his cancer diagnosis. It was the recipe for that toasted ham and cheese sandwich that I so loved. That's right, on the very day he learned he was going to die, he sat down and put the recipe into writing so I would never be without his cooking. It turned out that the supposedly simple sandwich my grandfather had been feeding me all those years was a much more complicated affair than I had imagined. Along with the titular ingredients, it required a certain amount of butter, a certain amount of mayo, a certain amount of onions, finely chopped. Then there was salt, pepper, paprika, and a ton of other ingredients that I'm not going to list because I don't want to give away his recipe. These days, I utilize that recipe whenever I can. My niece, Judy, is a particularly big fan of it. She requests it every time I babysit her, and I always oblige. A couple of weeks ago, however, I got the recipe wrong for the first time. I was having a hectic work day. I would have to collect Judy from school, make her favorite sandwich, and then head straight back to the office, leaving her in the care of my fiancé. I hastily prepared the snack as Judy watched cartoons in the other room. I placed the carelessly made sandwich into the toaster and pulled the lever, which immediately popped back up. I swore just softly enough for Judy not to hear me and tried again. Same result. I checked the plug, which was routed into the wall socket, and tried a third time. Once again, the lever popped back up. My only guess was that a fuse had blown, and I did not have the time to fix that, so I opted to do the unthinkable and not toast the sandwich. Judy would have to go with a cold ham and cheese sandwich, just this once. I walked over to the drawer and retrieved my cutting knife. My mind was still focused on work, but that quickly changed when I turned back towards the kitchen counter and saw my grandfather standing beside the toaster. Looking more like a fully physical being than a spirit, he gave me that disapproving but loving stare grandparents give when they want you to know you've done something wrong, but also have some wisdom to impart. So what was that wisdom my dear, departed grandfather wanted to share? I was about to find out. Without taking his eyes off me, he said in his familiar voice, "You forgot the mayo." And that was that. All of a sudden, he was gone. I don't remember a moment where he disappeared. He just wasn't there anymore. But he was right. I had forgotten the mayo. When my wits returned, there was nothing further from my mind than work. All there was making Judy that sandwich and doing it right. I opened it up, added a good dollop of mayo, and, just on the off chance, decided to try the toaster one last time. And this time it worked. When I returned home from work that evening, Judy told me it had been the best toasted ham and cheese sandwich I'd ever made. She still gets excited if I'm in a hurry when I pick her up, because she thinks the secret ingredient that made that particular sandwich so great was stress. I haven't told this story to too many people because it seems so absurd. The last person I shared it with laughed at me and questioned why my grandfather would go through the effort of returning to this world just to make sure somebody put mayo on a sandwich. A lot of people reading this are probably thinking the same thing too, but I don't care. My grandfather loved cooking, no matter what the meal was, and he loved me. I guess seeing me come so close to screwing up a dish that was so deeply personal to both of us was more than he could bear, and he decided to use one of his heavenly day passes to intervene. Thanks, Granddad. Number 1. Big Brother Jacob. My wife and I lost our first baby only a couple of hours after he was born. The weeks and months that followed were agony. The grief was too much for our relationship to bear, and divorce seemed inevitable. A little over a year after our son's passing, a friend persuaded us to spend a week on a Spanish island. She bought the all-inclusive package as a surprise for us because she thought it could save our marriage. And it did. Over the course of that week, we had many open and honest conversations and even made love for the first time since it all happened. Shortly after we returned home, my wife discovered that she was expecting once again. We weren't exactly ecstatic to hear this news. We had been through so much since my wife's last pregnancy, and were both certain this pregnancy would play out the same. If that happened, it would be the death blow to our marriage. But despite our fears, our baby was delivered without incident. We were relieved, to say the least. We decided to name our son Jacob. This was the same name we gave to our first son, but it just seemed right. Deep down, we probably thought this would wipe out the traumatic memories, and we could just pretend our newborn baby was the baby we'd had the whole time. That sounds a bit messed up, I know, but it's how our grieving minds worked. For a little bit, my wife and I were able to go days at a time without thinking about what had happened with our first pregnancy. It wasn't until our son started talking properly that we began really thinking about it again. One day, when Jacob was 6 years old, a colleague of mine stopped by our house. He introduced himself to my son, who said, "You have the same name as my daddy," before adding, "My brother has the same name as me." This almost knocked me off my chair. My wife and I had never told Jacob about his big brother. After keeping it to myself for nearly a week, I told my wife about the incident. Turned out Jacob had made a similar comment to her the following morning. He said something along the lines of, "Daddy has the same name as his friend, just like me and my brother." My wife dug a little further, asking Jacob for more details. He told her that his brother often played with him or comforted him when he was scared at night. "He's a good big brother," Jacob said, before adding, "He was here once, but he couldn't stay." We decided to question Jacob together, but information was not forthcoming. All of our attempts to learn more were met with silence, or by Jacob telling us he didn't remember anything else. But on the morning of his 7th birthday, just as he was about to tuck into his birthday pancakes, he told us, "Jacob eats pancakes sometimes too." Then, as if he realized his mistake, he added, "But he told me not to talk about him, because he doesn't want to make you sad." That was the last time our son ever spoke about seeing his brother. Jacob is a teenager now, and we've told him all about the sibling that came before him. Recently, my wife even asked him about those creepy incidents from his early years, but he claims to have zero memory of them. I believe he's telling the truth, but I can't help but wonder if he's keeping a secret for the big brother that he still talks to. So, those were 3 creepy but heartwarming encounters with deceased family members. Did they leave you with fear in your heart or a tear in your eye? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more scary stories. Although, we can't always promise they'll be served with a side of wholesomeness. Story number 1. Car Chase. The summer after I graduated from high school, my boyfriend was driving me to his home for the first time. He lived a town over from me. I left work early, and we went up to his parents' house in northern Michigan. It was my first time meeting them, and I was really looking forward to it. As we were driving, it got quite late into the night, and we saw a man lying on the ground in the strangest position, kneeling with his head on the ground and bent at a sharp angle so that he faced the street. It was around midnight at this point. We pulled over, and my boyfriend hopped out of the car to go check on the guy, when something stopped him and he jumped back into the car. He said he just didn't feel safe. Instead, he rolled the car window down and called out to him, but the man didn't respond. We debated it a bit, but ultimately thought it was a bad idea to get out of the car in the middle of the night. This was before cell phones, so we went around him with the intention of going to the nearest house to call 911. About 10 minutes later, there was an older Tahoe that started riding behind us and flashing its high beams. So we got up to about 60 in a 45. They didn't let up. We pulled off to the side road that his parents' house is off of, and they took the same turn. We thought this seemed weird because there's only about 30 or 40 houses on the road. So we went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end, but at that point in time led to a maintenance area. The car was still following us. At this point, I was freaking out because if we pulled into the house, they'd know where we lived, and they were still at our heels. My boyfriend was trying to stay calm, but I could tell he was freaking out too. He kept looking out the window and swearing, getting more and more agitated. He began to take a ton of random turns, and they kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. We finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic going through the intersection that gave us a few seconds of a head start. We pulled down a side street, turned off all our lights, and waited. We didn't speak. We were both waiting with bated breath. We probably waited about 20 minutes, but it felt like much longer. But we couldn't take it anymore. After that, we floored it to his parents' house and called 911 the second we got there. His parents could barely understand us. They'd expected us about an hour earlier, and we were belligerent by that stage. Unfortunately, the police were never able to find anything. One thing my boyfriend had noticed, but hadn't wanted to mention in the car because he didn't want to scare me further, was that the license plate of the other car had been taped over. Story number 2. Mindfulness driving. I've always loved to drive. It's how I found my happy place. Hours-long drives to nowhere with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in the rural USA, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways, cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities. And I'd usually go on these drives at night since there was less traffic to worry about. For years, I'd never had any kind of trouble. That was until a few months ago. I've done these long and lonely drives because I was in a very difficult place mentally and emotionally at the time, and these were the only things I felt truly helped. That night, I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north down those familiar, dark, winding, one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour. It was being all alone with no cars in sight, in seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses miles back from the road was lightless, and it was nothing but dead cornfields surrounding me. It was also silent as a grave. I got a strange, creepy feeling. I didn't know what it was. Something just felt off. I felt like I was in a Stephen King novel, in a way I had never felt on these drives before. I thought that maybe it was everything that was going on in my personal life that made me feel so uneasy. At this point, it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back up towards the city, I would head back home to the city. That roundabout was still about a half hour away. As I'm rounding another turn, I notice a vehicle with its hazards flashing maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of sedan, and oddly, the driver's side door was flung wide open. I couldn't catch sight of anyone in the car. The car was inching towards me until it was right beside me, so I slowed my vehicle, turned down my music, rolled down my passenger window, and called out to them, asking if they were okay. No one responded at first, and my uneasiness grew. The car started slowing down, and it stopped. Out of a mixture of both compassion and stupidity, I stopped too. I still waited in my car, though. All of a sudden, I hear a loud bang, bang from the driver's side window. I screamed and looked over. A man was pounding on my window and jiggling the handle of my locked car. I looked in the rear view mirror. I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the car, and they were running towards my car. They were wearing masks, a bit like the ones you see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I slammed on the gas and drove like hell, my heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I can't imagine anything good. I took one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their car to chase me. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road, watching me, and right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a third man emerge from the trees, also wearing one of those creepy masks. As soon as I made it to my town, I parked in the Walmart parking lot and started crying. When I calmed down a bit, I called one of my friends. She was scared for me and begged me to report it to the police. I did, and even gave them the location of where it happened. They said they investigated but never found anything. However, they told me that later that same night, another woman reported a similar incident. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe right away. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications of more creepy stories. Story number 1. A Night Out. I'm currently a senior in college, and there's a big bar scene. Students love hanging out at night. It's pretty much the only way to make friends and meet new people. And going out for the night to get special deals on alcohol so you can get plastered with your friends is kind of the go-to here. So on one such night, me and my friends all get dressed up, pre-gaming and pre-drinking at another friend's apartment before we ordered an Uber downtown to one of our pretty well-known college bars. Once we got in, my friends immediately split off into tiny groups spreading out over the club, looking for girls they wanted to shoot their shot. I wasn't really in the mood to meet anyone new that night. I was preoccupied with my studies and had just gotten out of a long relationship. So I was really just there to chill with my friends. I got caught up talking to a stranger, and we started playing darts when a girl came up to me. She was pretty cute, probably 5'5", so quite petite, and these really beautiful blonde curls. She had bright green eyes, freckles, and an equally bright smile. All in all, not the kind of person you'd be wary of at all. She asked if she could buy me some drinks, since her friends had wandered off to speak to some guys and she wanted some company. I of course accepted, because it sounded fun and she seemed really lovely. We chatted, played some darts, and had an all-around nice time. She introduced herself as Jenny and said she was studying as well and didn't live too far away. We stayed there till about 1 a.m. That was normal for the bars there. They all closed around 3 a.m. She was really interested in me and kept asking all kinds of questions. Who was I with? Did I live nearby? Did I live alone? Did I have family in the area? It felt like a really nice change of pace, because I'm usually the one learning about other people, not the other way around, so I was really enjoying myself. The whole time we spoke, made eye contact, was smiling, was really making me feel listened to. At some point, though, her demeanor began to change. She started becoming more flirty, touching my arm and coming up close to me. I mentioned to her that I'm not a one-night stand kind of guy, and that I'd just gotten out of a long relationship. What looked like anger flashed across her face, and I was worried I'd insulted her. I then thought I'd imagined it, though, because she quickly replaced it with another smile, and she suggested just going home and watching a movie instead. I agreed and started to pull my phone out to order us an Uber, but as I looked down, she grabbed my wrist and started dragging me to the door. I was so startled I stumbled a bit, and she went, "Come on." I was confused. I asked her if she was planning to drive after drinking, but she just laughed in response. She dragged me outside the club, and she pointed to a black car across the parking lot and said it was hers. I started to feel uneasy. I didn't like the idea of either of us driving after we'd been drinking, and I started to think she was more drunk than I'd realized. She grabbed my wrist to start dragging me again, and that's when I realized something. She claimed she'd driven alone and then met her friends at the bar earlier, but the lane the car was parked in was only for pickups. This was enough to make me uncomfortable, and I asked again if she was planning to drive the car. She said yes as she continued dragging me closer to it. As we got closer, I noticed the outline of 3 other guys in the car. It was as if they were trying to hide inside the car. At that point, my adrenaline kicked in, and I yanked my hand away from her and said there's no way in hell I'm getting in that car with her. She tried begging me one more time, saying we could do anything I wanted, anything at all, but I'd already turned around to head back to the club. She started cussing me out, practically screaming at the top of her lungs as I walked back up to the bouncers to go in. I saw her bang on the window and the doors opened, but I was back in the club before I saw anyone come out. I could still hear her screaming as I walked through the door. At this point, I started to feel shaky, thinking what if I hadn't seen the guys in the car when I did. Story number 2. Cocktail waitress. One of my first jobs was being a cocktail waitress. My shift time was a bit unholy. It was from 5 p.m. until 2 a.m. It wasn't the nicest of jobs. The place was a bit seedy, but it paid the bills, and I was trying to get myself through college. As a waitress, I'd become used to being harassed and to weird comments, particularly from men. It came with the job, and there wasn't anything the managers or any of the other staff could do about it. Usually, it wasn't anything too over the top or frightening. Most customers were regulars who flirted innocently. Up until this night, I'd never felt a sense of danger from any of the customers I'd waited on. On this particular night, I was being harassed by a creepy customer I'd never seen before. He'd made inappropriate remarks all night, commenting on my body, asking if I had a boyfriend, and stuff like that, nonstop. He tried to get my address from me, and he wouldn't stop inviting me back to his. He was relentless with his inappropriate remarks. At one point, I was serving him his drink. He reached out and put his hand on my butt. After that happened, I never went back to his table again. I decided if he wanted another drink, he'd have to go up to the bar and ask the bartender. This happened back in the late 90s, so it was a time when there were very little consequences to that kind of behavior. The bartender only made customers leave when they were far too drunk to sit on a bar stool or at a table. Otherwise, it was up to us to deal with any creepy customers, and the place didn't have the extra money to hire security. At closing time, he had no choice but to leave. Even though he was gone, I still felt such a sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the fact that he'd touched me. I wasn't easily spooked, but this guy had really freaked me out. There was just something off about him, and no one had dared to actually put their hands on me before. It took me nearly an hour after closing to finish cleaning up and to prepare the bar for the following day. So it was about 3 a.m. when I finally made my way through the dark parking lot to get to my car. It was such a deserted and isolated place at night. The parking lot had woods that surrounded it. That, in and of itself, was creepy. But as I was about halfway to my car, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He'd been crouching behind a car, not too far from where I was. I felt sick when I realized that he had been waiting over an hour for me to come out. I started to run towards my car. I was freaking out, mentally preparing what to do if he managed to get a hold of me. I ran as fast as possible. I made it to the car, managed to get my keys out in time, and jumped inside the car and locked the door. It was just in the nick of time because this man was now at my driver's side window, demanding that I roll it down. He kept yelling that he didn't want to hurt me, he only wanted to talk. He tried scratching my car window and pressing his face up against it. He began to pound on the window as I fumbled with my keys to try to get the hell out of there. I began to worry that he'd shatter my window. Finally, I got my car started, and as I put the car into reverse and backed out, he began to scream bloody murder. He was yelling for me to stop because I'd run over his foot. I don't know if I actually did run over his foot, but I wasn't going to stop anyway. Once home, I called the police. They came to take my report and get my description of the guy. At this point, I wasn't certain about whether I had injured him or not. I explained all of this to the police officer. The police sent another officer to the parking lot to see if he was still there and suffering from an injury. He wasn't. Nobody called the police to report a hit and run either. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the stories, please hit the like button or let us know what you think in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories. And if you have experienced a creepy story yourself that you want us to narrate, please send us an email. You'll find contact information below.